but you put them all together and there's a mess. But right now, Saudi Arabia is having economic problems. There, in the 70s, it was guaranteed. They were the kingpins. They had the money and they financed our debt, and that's where we bought so much of our oil. But that isn't the case right now. But the people are starting to suffer. If you're going to have a civil war, sometimes the winners of the war comes from the people. Maybe it's a bloody contest, but eventually they have to get support of the people. And right now, there's a lot of unhappy people there, a lot of Saudis who aren't employed. And so they're not the rich country that they used to be. And this may, be a real problem for them to deal with the people now that are having their standard of living lowered.
Yeah, they've had to enact some sweeping reforms. They put in a very unpopular austerity program for their vast bureaucracy. Everyone sort of works for the state, and they had to tighten the belt, so that became very unpopular. They actually had to even overturn part of that. But, and this is, I think, where you can see some fault lines, some friction. Bin Salman recently spent $500 million on a yacht that caught his eye in the south of France. So you can imagine these problems with austerity. They're stuck in a desert. They at least want to get some decent money. And then you have the king spending very, very wildly. You also have 33% of 15 to 24-year-olds completely out of work, and it's a very young country as well. So I think you have the seeds being sown for this kind of conflict.
And Qatar is involved in this thing too, because Saudis are very aggressive now. It reminds me of how we treat our allies. They're allies as long as they're obedient. And as long as all the Persian Gulf countries were obedient, to Saudi Arabia, they were okay, but all of a sudden there was too much independence with Qatar, and now they have been threatened, and it doesn't look like they're going to roll over, and that's going to add fuel to the fire too, because they're going to, if violence breaks out within that country, they can't help but they won't ignore it, and the Iranians, although I can't foresee Iranian troops, going into Saudi Arabia, no matter, but they're like a lot of others. They do have influence and they do have a position to take. I think that the amount of involvement they have in Yemen is probably overblown, but they have a concern about that. They have an influence, just like they have concerns of what's going on in Syria. So even though we're talking about Saudi Arabia and that government breaking down, it sort of blends into the chaos that has been created over there in the various countries. And the more we get involved, of course, the more chaos there is and the more breakdown. So this would be another example that we certainly, let's say there's a civil war and there's a breakdown and there's a regime change, even though we might not have been the number one factor, we are participating in it. We go over and promise, it looks like you're under a little bit of stress. Well, we'll guarantee you $100 billion worth of weapons to maintain order because we can deal with you. And besides, you work with the Israelis to maintain order in the region. So I could see this could be very, very important.
And the person who has now been shunted to the side, Mohammed bin Nayef, he was known for cracking down on Al Qaeda and other extremists, but he was also actually on rather friendly terms with the Emir of Qatar. There is sort of the question, did that have something to do with him being ousted? Because the claim was that Qatar is now getting too cozy with Iran and all these sorts of things. And the other issue is sort of laughable, how Saudi Arabia accused Qatar of funding terrorists when they're the biggest funder of terrorists. But, his replacement now, the young bin Salman, said, we will work hard so that the battle is on their side, inside Iran, which is taken as a real threat. And the Iranians call this a soft coup, this change in succession.
And when we're part of that blame, defending Saudi Arabia and not saying that they are promoters of terrorism as well, and yet they feed us into, and that it's Qatar, not Saudi Arabia. it's sort of like a little bit of fake news. But the media doesn't pick up on that. We mentioned this yesterday about some things, the media won't blame. They won't go back and forth who's giving the fake news. But how many times do we read in the paper that all these compliments and the promotions that the Saudis get at the United Nations, that they are the fighters against terrorism, and yet we do know exactly what they've been doing, and we've been involved with them all the way back to the Afghan War when the Soviets were in Afghanistan. We literally had our CIA training people to be violent, and then eventually that came back to haunt us.
Our viewers may be wondering, why are we talking so much about Saudi Arabia? This is a show about U.S. foreign policy. But I think that gets down to really what the underlying thing, which is the relationship between the aging king, the soon-to-be young king, and the Trump administration. We know that bin Salman has dined with Ivanka Trump and her husband Jared Kushner at least twice at private dinners. They're said to be very close. So where is U.S. foreign policy playing in this? Did President Trump give a wink to bin Salman as a successor? What is the U.S. trying to do? It would make sense if you consider Trump's very aggressive anti-Iranian